In this recording, I'm going to cover another one of the object-oriented programming fundamentals, polymorphism. Polymorphic objects are the shape-shifting superheroes of object-oriented programming. They are objects which can take on many forms, and as you'll find out as I will demonstrate to you, they're both powerful and flexible. Bit of info first, I record in high resolution so you don't have to watch on a blurry screen. Choose high definition if that will work for you. Do you want to join a growing group of PHP developers and take your skills to a new level? If that sounds like you, all you need to do is subscribe and click the notification icon, and welcome. So here's what we're going to do. I have a couple of files which are inventory files. One is in CSV format, as you can see here. It has a header and then 3 rows of data, and here I have an inventory file in JSON format which contains the exact same data but it's just in a different format. I'm going to build a mini application which is able to read either of those files in either format and take the content and return me this, an associative array in this exact format. So no matter whether it reads the CSV or the JSON, it will return me this array in this format. My code should be able to handle either scenario seamlessly and without making any adjustments because it will be polymorphic. Before I get into a full-blown explanation of polymorphism, we're just going to build out some of this application, so code along with me. I've created a class called CSV file reader, and that will implement a interface called file reader interface. So let's go and create that. File reader interface. And so as you can see, instead of the keyword class, it uses the keyword interface. This is going to act as our contract, so the classes which we create for reading the data files will implement this file reader interface, and there'll be one method which they must implement, and we're defining that here, read file as associative array. It'll take the file name as a argument, and it will return that associative array which I showed you earlier on. So if I look at my CSV file reader now, PHP Storm is shouting at me because I must implement that method. A lot of the time what I'll do before I start writing any code is I'll just add comments and sketch out the steps that I need to take in order to make this work. So I'm going to grab the rows from the file as arrays. I know I can do that with some of PHP's built-in CSV handling functionality. I'll separate the header, and then each part of the header will be a key which maps to a value. So this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to use array map. This takes 2 arguments, the first one being a callback function and the second one being an array. So the callback function, I'll use PHP's inbuilt str_getCSV. The second part here converts the file contents to an array. Each line of that file will be an array element. So in our case, each one of those elements is going to be a string with commas in it. And what happens is array map will loop through each of those lines, pass the line into the str_getCSV function, which will split it into an array at the commas. We'll end up with an array containing 4 arrays. The first one will be the header, and I'm splitting that out here using array shift. Then we need to somehow get the header elements, or the header keys, and match them up with the values, and we're going to do that like this. So we'll loop through each of the rows. As you can see, I've established an empty items array, and what we're going to do is loop through each of the rows, and then we're going to kind of zip the elements in the header and the row up together so that they're matching, and we do that using this built-in PHP method called array combine. We'll pass the header in as the first argument and then the row as the second. So each element in the header 1, 2, 3 will match up with each element in the row 1, 2, 3. We add our newly combined array to the items array, and then all we need to do is return it, and that, believe it or not, should return us our array in the exact our content in the exact same array format as what we specified. So I'm going to require once the file reader interface, and we'll try this out. So I'm just going to stay in the same file outside of the class, obviously outside of the class curly braces. So file reader equals new CSV file reader, and then I'm just going to call the method read file as associative array, and it's the inventory.csv file that I'm reading. I'll store that in an items array, and I'll just print that out using print_r function. I'll add a PHP end of line, which is more of a habit than anything else. And then I just need to call this using PHP CSV file reader, and that looks exactly the same as the associative array that we said we were aiming for from the start. So good progress. We'll comment this out. What I want to do now is create a class which is going to use the CSV file reader, and so I'm going to create something called stock manager, and what this does, or what it will appear to do, is read a CSV file of data and then update a database with the information from that file. The main method in that class will be this one, update stock from file. It will take a file name as the first argument, and for the second argument I'm using a method called dependency injection to inject a CSV file reader into the update stock from file method. Now CSV file reader is now a dependency for this method, and when you inject a class, or when you pass a class in as an argument to a method, you call it dependency injection. I'll not get too deep into it right now, but something like this CSV file reader, you refer to it as a service class because it performs a service for other classes, and you're usually more likely to inject it in through the constructor. I'll park that there though, and that's something we'll come back to at another time. For now we're doing it this way, and as you can see I'm using the CSV file reader read file as associative array method. I'm getting the return value of that and storing it in stock items, which will be an array, and I'm just going to loop through that, and then I'm pretending that I'm adding a record to the database. What I'm actually going to do is just print it out. I'll require once the CSV file reader.php file, and then once I've done that I'm going to need a file where I can go and play around with this stuff and print stuff out to the browser. So in the chapter 3 folder, as usual, I'm going to create a file called polymorphism.php, add some HTML. I'll rename the file title to polymorphism, opening and closing PHP tags. And so what do I need to do here? I'll require once the stock manager file, and then I'll create a new stock manager with stock manager equals new stock manager. And then what I want to do is call our method the update stock from file. So it takes two arguments, which the first one being the file name, and we're still using CSV, and then the second one we need a CSV file reader, so we'll also create one of those. CSV file reader equals new CSV file reader, and we required that in the stock manager file, so this should work. Let's go over to the browser and take this for a test drive. So localhost, I'm using port 8000, and then it's polymorphism.php. Okay, so the data looks good. I'm not sure about the formatting, so I've used a line break. Instead I'm just going to use a HTML break tag, and there we go, that's much better. I'll just bump the size up on this a bit so it's easy to read, and now we'll turn our attention to the JSON data. So what we want to be able to do is also read the JSON inventory file and update the database using that, but we can't really do it using what we've got currently because the CSV file reader, this is set up to handle CSV only, so we need another solution. We're going to need a JSON file reader, so let's create one of those. And again, I want this to be able to return me an array of data in exactly the same format as my CSV file reader. So I've called the file JSON file reader. This is also going to implement the file reader interface, so I'll require the file reader interface PHP file. Class JSON file reader implements file reader interface. As you can see, the squiggly red line is PHP Storm telling me that I must implement the read file as associative array method, and so exactly the same method name, except the internals of it will work differently. Like the CSV file reader, I'm going to sketch out using comments. Doing this kind of thing is quite good practice to get into because it just keeps you focused on the task in mind rather than trying to think as the code as you go along. You end up writing a lot more code than what you need to that way, I find. So I'm going to use the file get contents method. I'll pass in the file name, and that will take the contents of my file and read it into a string. So the file was in JSON format, which means I'll end up with a JSON string. And then in order to convert that to an associative array, I can just use PHP's JSON decode method. That will take the string as the first argument, and if I pass true boolean as a second, that will convert it to an associative array. And then all we need to do is return that items array, and it should return it in the exact same format as our CSV file reader. Let's test that theory now, and we'll stick in the same file like we did with the CSV file reader just to test this out. That's the code you need. We're just creating the class, calling the method. Let's go to the terminal and run this now. So PHP JSON file reader, and that looks exactly the same format, the same data as what we got back from our CSV file reader. So this is interesting. We now have two files, the JSON file reader and the CSV file reader, which both have the same method names. Let's go back to our polymorphism file, and we'll try and use the JSON file reader in our stock manager in the same way that we did with the CSV file reader. So JSON file reader equals new JSON file reader, and instead of passing in the CSV file reader, I'm going to try and pass in the JSON file reader. So you probably know by now that this isn't going to work, but just go along with it for the time being. I'll require the JSON file reader. Let's move over to the browser and give it a refresh. Fatal error, uncaught type error. So argument 2 past the stock manager update stock1 file must be an instance of CSV file reader. We've tried to pass in the JSON file reader. So I did this deliberately really to illustrate what happens when you don't use polymorphism, when you use concrete dependencies. Let's have a look at the method. So it's totally inflexible because we've injected CSV file reader, which means that we are stuck with only CSV file reader or a child of a CSV file reader, and it eliminates all other possibilities. Let's change that and make our code more flexible. So as you can see here, instead of injecting the CSV file reader, I'm injecting a file reader interface. I'm going to change all references to the name CSV file reader to file reader, which is more abstract. And as you recall, both the JSON file reader and the CSV file reader both implement this interface. So you might be thinking, where does polymorphism come into this? So thanks for your patience. Let's cover a bit of theory now. I'm going to knock up an interface file, or a file where I can play around and create classes. So I'll create an interface called random interface, and I'm going to create a couple of classes, class A, and I'm just going to leave them as empty classes for the time being, class B, and I'm going to make class B extend class A. So in PHP there is a way of checking if something is an instance of another class, or if an object is regarded to be an instance of a particular class. I've instantiated two objects here, one for class A and one for class B, and I'm just going to write a little conditional, and using the instance of, which checks if something's an instance of a particular class, I'm just going to check various scenarios. The first one is fairly straightforward. I'm checking if object A is an instance of class A. So I think we both know what the answer to this one will be, but we'll go and run it in the terminal anyway. So random interface, and it's true. Object A is an instance of class A. Let's try another one. As you can see, class B extends class A. So what do you think will be the outcome if we check this one? Is class B an instance of A? Over to the terminal, and it's true. Okay, so let's now check if object A is an instance of random interface. False. Let's make class A implement random interface. So class A implements random interface. What do you think? True. So this is getting interesting. If you think of the example we've been using, we've got a lot of power here. How about if we check if B is an instance of random interface? So B is a child of A implements random interface. What do you think? That's also true. Polymorphism is the ability of an object to take on many forms. So in PHP, an object that can pass more than one instance of test is considered to be polymorphic. So keep a note of that definition, because you'll definitely be asked it in an interview at some point. Let's change this require once, so we're now requiring the file reader interface, and we'll go over to our polymorphism file and we'll demonstrate that our code is polymorphic. So the first one we're going to check is we'll just leave it as it is with the CSV file reader being injected. Refresh. That works. We'll also prove that the update stock from file reader object can be a JSON file reader. So stock manager Update stock from file. We're reading the inventory JSON file and we're going to use the JSON file reader this time. Over to the browser, refresh. It works for both because the file reader object is able to take on many forms. So there might be parts of your code where you want to read CSV files, there might be parts of your code where you want to read JSON files. We're now equipped to be able to do either of those things. Our code's nice and loose. The file reader just has to implement the file reader interface, and that permits us to inject it into here, and then the underlying mechanism of how the file is read will change dependent on whether you're using JSON file reader, CSV file reader. This recording was about polymorphism, but we've touched on some dependency injection there. Don't worry about understanding everything because we'll be covering dependency injection in a lot more detail later on in the course. Hope you've enjoyed this one and that you have a clear understanding of what polymorphism is. Now, be sure to give it a like if it's helped you, and don't hesitate to share if you want to help others like yourself. That's what good developers do. And if you want YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the notification icon. I release new material 2 times a week, and details of my schedule can be found under the discussion tab of my YouTube channel homepage.